what kind of relationship do you have with your father? Your real father. It's often ambivalent, right? Because there's an element of him that encouraged you, hopefully, because without the encouragement of your father, man, the world is a dismal place. It's very difficult to be a courageous person unless you have your father in body and spirit behind you. It's very demoralizing. Like, it really kills people not to have their mother. They just don't recover from that. And I think people can recover from a fragmented father relationship, but it's the next worst thing. You know, because if your father rejects you or doesn't form a relationship with you, it's as if the spirit of civilization has left you outside the walls as of little worth. It's very difficult for people to recover from that. So the father should be an encouraging force, but can be a tyrannical and crushing force. And so that's a very difficult thing to get right, partly because if you're my son, then I should impose the highest standards of behavior on you. And I should always be judging what you're doing. I should be judging it with the aim of making the best in you come forward. But getting that balance exactly right is very difficult. And so it's easy for a father to swing too much into judgment, let's say. And then, of course, mothers can play this role too. To swing too far into the domain of judgment and to be too harsh. And to the degree that the father has his own pathologies, he's going to do that imperfectly. Well, my father's a formidable person, and like he's really good with little kids. We had a lot of friction when I was a teenager, and that took some time to sort out. But there were complicated reasons for that. Some of them involved ill health of various sorts, and teenage stupidity, and some intransigence on his part because he's quite a stubborn person. But both my parents. I've been blessed with my parents because they're extraordinarily honest people. I can't think of a time, and this is literally the truth, I can't think of a time when I believe that my parents lied to me about anything. And that's a great gift. The other thing that my father bequeathed to me, I would say, when I was a child, was an unshakable confidence that I could do what I put my mind to, put my efforts to. And he truly believed that. And there's something that's lodged inside me as like an unshakable foundation. So one of the things you can think about this when you're parents too, and this is probably especially relevant for the men, because one of the things you might ask is what role do men play in the socialization of children? And one thing that men really do seem to do with kids is to engage in rough and tumble play, especially once they're a little older than 2, say 2 to 5 or something. And kids love that. They absolutely love rough and tumble play. Gets them so excited that, they get out of control fundamentally. But rough and tumble play is an excellent mode of socialization because it teaches the child the distinction between aggression and too much aggression, right? Because if you're wrestling with a kid, the kid has to keep their behavioral output under a fair degree of control to keep the game going, to make it rough enough to be exciting, but not so rough that they get hurt or, that they stick their thumb in their dad's eye or something like that. And you can think of that from a Piagetian sense too, because it's a game, but imagine that if you're trying to figure out how to configure yourself around other people, if you haven't had that rough and tumble play, you don't really know where the boundaries of your body are, and you don't know how much you can take and how much you can be stretched and how much you can be thrown around and when something actually hurts rather than is frightening. And so all of that intense sort of play that boys in particular are likely to engage in, although girls also like it, seems to be very useful for teaching children about how to engage with the world and with other people in a physical way, and that's one of the physiological foundations for higher order socialization. So it's very useful. I mean, I've often noted that children who haven't had the opportunity to engage in physical play, they're kind of awkward. They're not seated well in their body, and it's like they're kind of vague physically. Whereas the ones who've been twisted around and bent and thrown up in the air and, wrestled in general, they're a lot more conscious of their limits and their abilities in their body. And they're also much more able to invite other kids to play. Richard also asked, how can I talk about the resentments of my childhood in a way that benefits them instead of giving them guilt? See, what I would ask if you came to talk to me and you had that question, I would say, first of all, well, what resentments list them out, man. Write them down. Okay? So that you know what they are. Because each of those resentments is going to be a different thing, and the strategy that's associated with each might vary as a consequence of the particularity of the resentment. So I would say you should start by writing them down. Like, what's your problem exactly? Here's all the things that I can think of that I'm angry about with regard to my child. Write that down. And then see which ones are still living. And then you have to figure out, well, what do you want from your parents exactly? Do you want them to apologize? Do you want them to understand what they did wrong? Do you want to punish them? Do you want to let them learn to know you better? Do you want to change the way they're interacting with you now? Do you want to learn your own lessons from your bad experience so that when you're a parent, you don't make the same mistake? Do you merely want to have a chance to express yourself? Like, what are the resentments? So we can walk through the process we already described. Lay them out. And comprehensively, you might want to make a list of everything that you think you might conceivably be annoyed about with regards to your parents, no matter how trivial, right? Because that way you scour your memory for things that you're holding onto in a bitter way. And maybe you have your justification. I'm not suggesting that you don't. But you need to discover what baggage you're carrying. Then you have to figure out, well, what can I let go of? And what's core? And I would say what's really core is if there are ways that your parents treated you that are still affecting you or that are affecting your relationships with them now, those really need to be dealt with because they're not done. They're not in the past, right? They're not even resentments of your childhood. They're still part of your ongoing life. Okay, so now you have all your resentments laid out. I guess you would say, something like, look, Mom and Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about that's been bothering me for a long time. And I pick one of the more trivial things to begin with. Like, here's a memory I have. And don't get all high and mighty about it because, you might have misconstrued the situation as a child. It's highly probable. And they may have had their reasons. And you may not even remember the situation, let's say, correctly or the way they remember it. You say, well, here's something that happened when I was a kid and it still bothers me. And do you remember what happened? That's an open-ended question. Do you remember what happened? Why did this go this way? And then I would do an awful lot of listening, because you are trying to gather information. And the more your parents can tell you about what happened in those situations, I would say the better off you're likely to be.
There's the father that you have, and that's a human being, that's a man like other men, a man among men. But then there's the father as such, and that's the spirit of the father. And insofar as you have a father, you have both at the same time. You have the personal father that's a man among other men, just like anyone else's father. But insofar as that man is your father, that means that he's something different than just another person. And what he is the incarnation of the Spirit of the Father. And to see that, to take it to what? To disrespect that carelessly. Like Noah makes a mistake, right? He produces wine and gets himself drunk. And you might say, well, if he's sprawled out there for everyone to see, it's hardly Ham's fault if he stumbles across him. But the book is laying out a danger. And the danger is that, well, maybe you catch your father at his most vulnerable moment, and if you're disrespectful, then you transgress against the Spirit of the Father. And if you transgress against the Spirit of the Father and lose respect for the Spirit of the Father, then that is likely to transform you into a slave. That's a very interesting idea. And I think it's particularly interesting, maybe not particularly interesting, but it's particularly germane, I think, to our current cultural situation, because I think that we're pushed constantly to see the nakedness of our fathers, so to speak, because of the intense criticism that's directed towards our culture. We're constantly exposing its weaknesses and vulnerabilities and, let's say, nakedness. And there's nothing wrong with criticism, but the thing about criticism is the purpose of criticism is to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's not to burn everything to the ground, right? It's to say, well, we're going to carefully look at this. We're going to carefully differentiate. We're going to keep what's good and we're going to move away from what's bad. But the point of the criticism isn't to identify everything as bad. It's to separate what's good from what's bad so that you can retain what's good and move towards it. And to be careless at that is deadly, because you're inhabited by the Spirit of the Father. Insofar as you're a cultural construction, then you're inhabited by the Spirit of the Father. And to be disrespectful towards that means to undermine the very structure that makes you not all of what you are, certainly not all of what you are, but a good portion of what you are, insofar as you're a socialized cultural entity. And if you pull the foundation out from underneath that, what do you have left? You can hardly manage on your own. It's just not possible. You're a cultural creation. And it does seem to me that anyone who lives in the West, in the Western culture at this time in history and in this place, and who isn't simultaneously grateful for that, is half blind, at least, because it's never been better than this. And it could be so much worse. And it's highly likely that it will be so much worse, because for most of human history, so much worse is the norm.